I never imagined that the person who shared my room for 17 years, who taught me to ride a bike and defended me from bullies at school, would be the same person who nearly destroyed my life completely. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 32 years old, a civil engineer in Portland, Oregon, and for the past 8 months I've lived a true nightmare brought on by the only person I trusted completely. My older brother, Marcus, has always been my hero, my best friend, my confidant. But it was all a carefully constructed lie that fell apart in the worst possible way. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment where you're watching from. What I'm about to tell you here will make you rethink everything about family trust. It all started in March of last year, when I finally realized my dream of starting my own construction company. I had saved every penny for 6 years, working 2 jobs, sacrificing vacations and outings with friends, all to raise the $150,000 I needed to start. My wife, Jennifer, supported me unconditionally throughout, putting up with my absences, lonely dinners, and weekends when I was too busy to pay attention to her. When I finally signed the papers for Carter & Associates Construction, I felt all that hard work had been worth it. I threw a modest party at home, just with close family and a few close friends. Marcus was there, hugged me tightly, and told me he was proud of me. I believed every word. 2 weeks after opening the company, Marcus showed up at my office with a proposal. He'd been a financial advisor for almost 10 years and had a sizable client base in Seattle and Portland. He said he could help me invest some of the company's capital to maximize profits while I waited for the first big contracts to come in. He showed me detailed spreadsheets, growth projections, and success stories from other clients. Everything seemed completely legitimate and professional. I thought to myself how lucky I was to have such a capable and helpful brother. He suggested I transfer $80,000 to an investment account that he would personally manage, promising returns of at least 15% within 6 months. For someone starting a business, that sounded like a godsend. Jennifer was immediately suspicious. She always had a sixth sense for these things, a keen intuition I used to dismiss because I thought she was overly cautious. That night, over dinner, she asked me if I was absolutely sure about letting Marcus manage so much money. She asked if I'd asked for references, if I'd seen receipts from other clients, if I'd signed formal contracts with protection clauses. I laughed in her face and told her I was talking about my brother, not some stranger on the internet. I told her she was being paranoid and that Marcus would never do anything to hurt me. She stayed quiet, but I saw the concern in her eyes. God, how I wish I'd listened to that woman. I signed all the documents Marcus brought, transferred the $80,000 to the account he indicated, and moved on with my life, focused on securing contracts and getting my company off the ground. The first 2 months were intense. I worked 14 hours a day, preparing estimates, visiting construction sites, and negotiating with suppliers. Marcus emailed me monthly reports showing that the investment was paying off, with colorful graphs and numbers that were steadily rising. I showed them to Jennifer with a victorious smile, as if to say, "See, you were wrong about him." She just shook her head and went back to her work. Now I understand she never wanted to be right about that. In June, I landed my first major contract, a complete renovation of a downtown Portland office building valued at $300,000. I was over the moon, and I called Marcus immediately to share the news. He seemed genuinely happy for me, saying he knew I could do it, that he'd always believed in my potential. We planned a celebratory lunch the following weekend at an Italian restaurant we'd frequented since we were teenagers. During that lunch, amidst laughter and childhood stories, he casually mentioned that he was experiencing some temporary liquidity issues due to a change in financial market regulations. He said he'd need to hold my investment for 3 months beyond the original term to guarantee the promised return. I saw no problem with that. July arrived, bringing the intense heat of an Oregon summer and the first cracks in the perfect facade of my life. I needed to make a large payment to construction material suppliers, about $45,000, and my cash flow was tight because the client for the large contract had delayed the first payment. I called Marcus, asking him to release at least half of the invested funds to cover this urgent expense. He took 2 days to return my call, something completely unusual. When he finally answered, his voice was strange and tense. He said there was a technical issue with the brokerage, which he was resolving, and that I would have my money in a week at most. That was the first time I felt a chill down my spine regarding my brother. A week passed, and nothing. 2 weeks and only vague apologies via text message. Suppliers began pressuring me, threatening to suspend delivery if I didn't pay. My reputation was on the line. My first major contract could be ruined before it even got started. Jennifer suggested we go in person to Marcus's office in Seattle, about 170 miles away. I initially resisted, thinking it would be overly dramatic, but when the 3rd week arrived with no concrete response, I had no choice. We drove there on a Thursday morning, my stomach churning the entire way. Something inside me knew we were in for something terrible. The address Marcus had given me as his office was a generic co-working space in a commercial building near Pike Place Market. When we asked at the front desk for Marcus Carter, the clerk checked the system and said she'd never had any clients registered under that name. My heart raced. Jennifer held my hand tightly as I showed her photos of my brother on my phone. The woman looked closely and said yes, she'd seen that man around a few times, but he always came as a guest of other members, never had his own office. I felt my legs weaken. Jennifer had to hold me as we walked away. On the sidewalk, sitting on the curb of that busy Seattle street, with tourists happily passing by, I finally realized I'd been duped. I tried calling Marcus about 20 times that day. They all went straight to voicemail. I left dozens of messages that went unanswered. I drove to his house in a Seattle suburb, but the house was empty with a for rent sign out front. Neighbors said he'd moved out 3 weeks ago without telling anyone. I returned to Portland in absolute shock, unable to process the magnitude of what was happening. My brother, my best friend since forever, had stolen $80,000 from me and disappeared. Jennifer drove back because I was shaking too much to hold the wheel. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't blame me for anything. She just held my hand the whole way as silent tears streamed down my face. The next morning I went to the bank and requested all the statements related to the transfer I'd made. I discovered that the account I'd sent the money to was Marcus's personal account, not a business investment account as he'd told me. The bank manager, a man in his 50s with a sympathetic expression, explained that I had been the victim of a classic family fraud. He suggested I seek a lawyer immediately and file a police report. I left that bank feeling stupid, used, betrayed in the worst possible way. How had I been so foolish as to trust blindly? How had I not seen the signs? Jennifer always had, but I was blinded by brotherly love, by shared history, by childhood memories that now seemed tainted and false. I hired a lawyer specializing in financial fraud, a man named Robert Chen who had an office in downtown Portland. He listened to my story attentively, taking detailed notes, and when I finished, he sighed deeply before speaking. He said that family fraud cases were the most complicated because they involved not only the legal aspect, but also an entire emotional dimension that made the process extremely painful. He explained that I would need to prosecute my own brother criminally, that there would be a police investigation, and that everything would likely become public. He asked if I was prepared for that, for Marcus possibly being arrested, for exposing our family to this scandal. I looked at Jennifer, who was sitting next to me, and she nodded encouragingly. "Yes," I told the lawyer, "I'm prepared for whatever it takes." But before I took any legal action, I had to do one thing. I had to tell our parents what Marcus had done. They lived in a comfortable home in Eugene, Oregon, about 2 hours from Portland, and had no idea what was happening. My father, Richard Carter, was a 68-year-old retired history teacher. My mother, Susan, was 65 and volunteered at a local library. They adored both their children equally, proud of our accomplishments, always present for every important moment. The thought of breaking their hearts with this news tore me apart. But they needed to know the truth about who Marcus really was. I arranged a Sunday lunch at their house, saying only that I needed to talk about something important. Jennifer accompanied me for moral support. All the way to Eugene, I mentally rehearsed how I would begin that impossible conversation. How do you tell your parents that one child stole from the other? How do you destroy their image of a son who was always exemplary, successful, and respected? When we arrived and saw my mother at the door, with that warm smile, preparing the family's favorite lunch, I wanted to get back in the car and run away. But I couldn't. The truth had to come out no matter how much it hurt. After lunch, we sat in the living room where I spent my entire childhood. I looked at the photos on the wall, Marcus and I at various ages, smiling, hugging, happy. I took a deep breath and began to tell everything from the beginning. I watched my father's smile gradually fade, replaced by an expression of disbelief and then horror. My mother began to cry before I even finished the story. When I finally finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. My father stood, went to the window, and stared out at the garden with his back to us. My mother held a handkerchief, wiping away the tears that wouldn't stop falling. And there I was, sitting on the sofa of my childhood, feeling like I'd just blown my family into 1,000 irreparable pieces. My father finally turned from the window after what seemed like an eternity of silence. His face was flushed, and I could see the veins on his neck standing out, something that only happened when he was deeply shaken. He asked if I was absolutely sure of what I was saying, if there was any possibility of misunderstanding, some reasonable explanation for all of this. His voice trembled as he spoke, and I could tell he was clinging to any shred of hope that his eldest son was under criminal. I showed him all the documents I'd brought, the bank statements, Marcus's emails with vague excuses, the fake office address. Every piece of paper I placed on the table was like a sledgehammer to the fantasy my parents had constructed about who Marcus really was. My mother finally managed to speak through her sobs. She asked if I'd been able to reach Marcus, if he'd given me any explanation, anything that might make sense of it all. I told her he'd simply disappeared, moved house without warning, turned off his phones, vanished like smoke. She put her hands to her face and began to cry even harder, shaking her head repeatedly as if she could erase that reality through denial. Jennifer got up and went to her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. My father sat back down heavily in the armchair, as if his legs could no longer support him. The man who had been strong and resolute my entire life seemed to have aged 10 years in a matter of minutes. Then my father asked a question that completely caught me off guard. He asked if Marcus had done this to anyone else, if I knew of any other cases. I hadn't thought about it until that moment. I'd been so focused on my own situation that I hadn't considered the possibility of more victims. The look on my father's face told me he knew something, had some information he hadn't shared yet. He looked at my mother, who looked away, embarrassed. That's when my father confessed that Marcus had borrowed money from them 3 months earlier, saying he was having a temporary cash flow problem due to an investment gone wrong. They'd lent him $25,000, practically all their savings beyond their retirement savings. I felt my blood boil in that moment. Marcus hadn't just stolen from me, he'd stolen from our own parents, 2 elderly people who'd worked their entire lives to earn a decent retirement. I asked why they hadn't told me, why they'd kept it a secret. My mother explained that Marcus had asked them not to say anything because he'd be embarrassed if I knew he was having financial problems. She said he'd promised to return the money within 2 months, but that deadline had already passed 3 weeks ago, and he'd been stalling, making excuses, promising he'd fix it the following week. They were starting to get worried, but they never imagined it was part of a larger fraud scheme. My parents' naivete broke my heart even more. Jennifer asked if they had any documents, any proof of the transfer. My father got up and went to get a folder from his office. He returned with papers showing the bank transfer and some text messages exchanged with Marcus. I asked to take pictures of everything with my cell phone, saying my lawyer would need to see them. At that moment, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to prosecute Marcus for stealing from me. I was going to make sure he paid for stealing from our parents as well. They initially resisted, saying they didn't want to see their son arrested, that perhaps there was another way to resolve the matter. But I was firm. I told them Marcus had made conscious choices, that he knew exactly what he was doing, and that there needed to be consequences. Over the next few days, I immersed myself in an obsessive investigation into my brother's life. I began contacting people I knew were his clients, using the contact list I had from his phone before he disappeared. What I discovered was absolutely shocking. Of the 10 people I managed to speak to, 7 had stories similar to mine. Marcus had convinced friends, co-workers, and even neighbors to invest money with him, promising guaranteed returns and complete security. In total, I discovered that he had stolen over $400,000 from at least 15 different people over the past 2 years. He was a serial financial predator who used his charm, his appearance as a successful professional, and people's trust to destroy lives. One of the victims who had a profound impact on me was a 72-year-old woman named Margaret Bloom. She was Marcus's neighbor in Seattle and had invested her life savings, $53,000, trusting in his promises. When I spoke to her on the phone, her voice trembling, telling me that she now didn't have enough money to pay for medical treatment she needed, a hip surgery she'd been putting off for years. She cried on the phone, saying she trusted Marcus because he'd always been so kind to her, helping with heavy shopping, fixing things around her house. He'd deliberately built a relationship of trust so he could exploit it later. When I hung up the phone, I had to leave the house and walk for an hour around the neighborhood because I was so angry I felt like I was going to explode. I organized a meeting with all the victims I could locate in a community hall in Portland. We were 17 people in total, each with their own story of betrayal and loss. There was a young couple who had invested their savings for a down payment on their first home, $40,000 that had taken years to accumulate. A middle-aged man who had invested $32,000 into his 3 children's education fund, which would guarantee their college education. A divorced woman who had invested her share of the estate, $60,000, which represented her new start in life. Each story was more painful than the last, and the pattern was always the same. Marcus would identify people in vulnerable moments or with some money saved, build trust, and then attack. We collectively hired a larger law firm specializing in complex fraud and financial crimes. The lead attorney, Thomas Bradford, was an imposing man in his late 40s with a reputation for being relentless in white-collar crime cases. He reviewed all our cases, assembled a comprehensive dossier, and said we had more than enough evidence for not only a criminal case, but also multiple civil cases. He explained that Marcus could face 5 to 15 years in prison if convicted, and would be required to repay all the stolen money, plus interest and damages. The problem was finding him first. He had completely disappeared, and the Seattle police had issued a warrant for his arrest, but so far there were no concrete leads on his whereabouts. Meanwhile, my life was falling apart in other areas. The company I had worked so hard to build was on the verge of bankruptcy. Without the money Marcus had stolen, I couldn't maintain the cash flow necessary to complete the major contract. I had to lay off the 3 employees I had hired, all of them family men who depended on that job. The client for the major contract terminated the agreement and sued me for breach of contract, seeking $50,000 in damages for delays and losses. Suppliers began calling me daily, demanding late payments. My dream was dying before my eyes, all because of my own brother's greed and cruelty. Jennifer was my rock throughout this hellish time. She worked as an English teacher at a public school, and her salary of $3,200 a month was all that kept our household afloat. We had to cancel our plans to have children, which were scheduled for that year. We sold our newest car and were left with only an old 2008 that was constantly having mechanical problems. We cut all non-essential expenses, cancelling Netflix, Spotify, the gym, everything. Dinners out became distant memories. There were nights when I would wake up at 3 in the morning in a cold sweat, with panic attacks wondering how I was going to pay the next month's bills. Jennifer would hold me, telling me we would get through this together, that the most important thing was that we had each other. But the truth was, I was breaking inside. Marcus's betrayal wasn't just financial, it was emotional and psychological. He wasn't some stranger who had deceived me. He was the person who knew all my vulnerabilities, all my dreams, all my insecurities. He had used our sibling bond, our shared history, our childhood memories as weapons against me. Every good memory I had of him was now tainted by doubt. Had he ever truly cared about me? Or had I always been just a potential mark, someone to be exploited when the time was right? These questions plagued me constantly, robbing me of sleep, my peace, my ability to trust anyone. My parents were even worse off. My mother developed severe insomnia and had to start taking anxiety medication. She would call me crying in the middle of the night, asking where she had gone wrong in raising Marcus, what she had done wrong to raise a son capable of such cruelty. I had no answers for her. My father, always the family's pillar of strength, became visibly depressed. He stopped taking his morning walks, stopped going to the chess club he had attended for 20 years, and practically isolated himself from the world. When I visited, he would sit silently for hours, staring into space. It was as if Marcus had killed something essential within them, stolen not only their money, but their ability to trust, to believe in the basic goodness of people. 3 months after it all began, I received a text message from an unknown number. It was Marcus. The message simply said, "Sorry, bro, I messed up. I don't know how to fix this. Don't try to find me." My first reaction was absolute rage. He had the audacity to send a generic apology message after destroying so many lives. I immediately forwarded the message to my lawyer and the police, who began tracing the number. They discovered it was a prepaid phone purchased in Las Vegas, Nevada. So that was where he was hiding, the perfect city for someone wanting to disappear amidst crowds and neon lights. The Las Vegas police were alerted, but in a city that size, finding someone who doesn't want to be found is like looking for a needle in a haystack. I replied to his message, even though I knew it was probably useless. I wrote, "Sorry doesn't pay the bills, Marcus. Sorry doesn't give back the money you stole from 15 innocent people. Sorry doesn't mend our parents' broken hearts. You're a coward and you'll pay for everything you've done." The message was delivered but never read. He had probably already discarded that SIM card, once again avoiding any real confrontation with the consequences of his actions. In that moment, sitting in the living room of my house that I could lose at any moment if I couldn't pay the mortgage, I made a promise to myself. No matter how long it took, how much effort it took, I would find Marcus and make sure he answered for every penny stolen, every life ruined, every tear shed because of him. 2 weeks after Marcus's ghost message, something happened that completely changed the course of the investigation. One of the victims, a man named David Hernandez, who had lost $38,000, called me saying he had important information. He worked as an insurance investigator and had used his professional contacts to do some research on his own. We arranged to meet for coffee at a Starbucks in downtown Portland. As we sat down, David placed a brown folder on the table between us and said that what I was about to see would shock me. I thought I was beyond shock, that nothing could surprise me about Marcus anymore. I was completely wrong. David opened the folder and began showing documents he'd obtained through his contacts at banks and financial institutions. Marcus wasn't operating alone. He had a partner, a woman named Vanessa Rodriguez, whom he'd met 3 years ago at an investment seminar in San Francisco. She had a history of financial fraud in 2 different states and had even served 18 months in prison in Nevada for a pyramid scheme between 2018 and 2019. After leaving prison, she moved to Seattle, and that's when she met my brother. Apparently, they began working together, with her teaching Marcus all the manipulation and fraud techniques she'd honed over the years. I looked at her photos on the documents, an attractive woman of about 35 with a cold, calculating gaze. The most disturbing thing was that Marcus had kept this woman completely hidden from his entire family. No one knew she existed. He always said he was single, focused on his career, that he didn't have time for serious relationships. All lies. While we ate dinner together on holidays, while he came to my house to watch football games, while he consoled my mother with the assurance that one day he would find the right person, he had a criminal partner who was probably sitting in some apartment counting the money he'd stolen from innocent people. His duplicity knew no bounds. David had even obtained an address where Vanessa had lived in Seattle, a luxury apartment in Belltown that cost $4,500 a month. Stolen money paying for a life of luxury while I struggled to keep my home. I immediately took all this information to Thomas Bradford, my lawyer. He was visibly excited by the discovery because we now had not only a criminal, but a criminal conspiracy, which significantly increased the potential penalties. He said he would share everything with the district attorney handling the case, and that this would likely expedite the federal investigation. The FBI might get involved if we could prove that Marcus and Vanessa had operated in multiple states, which seemed increasingly likely. The idea of federal agents hunting my brother left me with mixed feelings, a mixture of satisfaction at seeing justice served and profound sadness that it had come to this. I decided I needed to know more about Vanessa, to understand who this woman was, who had helped turn my brother into a criminal, or perhaps had simply revealed who he'd always been beneath the mask. I used social media, public records, and any available tool to build a profile of her. I discovered that she had grown up in Los Angeles, came from a wealthy family, but had been disinherited in her early 20s for reasons I couldn't uncover. She had studied economics at UCLA but never graduated. Her first arrest was at 27 for credit card fraud. After that, it was a series of increasingly sophisticated scams until the Ponzi scheme conviction that landed her in prison. What intrigued me was how Marcus, who had always been so uptight, so concerned with his reputation and image, had gotten involved with someone like that. I spoke to some of his former co-workers I managed to track down. One of them, a guy named Stephen who had worked with Marcus for 4 years, told me he'd started noticing changes in him about 3 years ago, right around the time he met Vanessa. Marcus became more secretive, more distant, and started talking a lot about making money fast, about successful people who didn't follow the traditional rules. Stephen said he even confronted Marcus once, asking if everything was okay, if he was involved in something shady. Marcus laughed in his face and said Stephen was too young to understand high-level play. It was the last meaningful conversation they had. The more I discovered, the more I realized my brother had completely changed who he was, or revealed who he'd always been hiding. I began mentally reviewing our childhood and adolescence, looking for signs I'd missed. There were some incidents that now made more sense. When Marcus was 16, he was accused of stealing money from the school fund, but he vehemently denied it, and my parents believed him, blaming someone else. When he was 20, there was an unresolved credit card issue with a college roommate, but Marcus had a convincing story that exonerated him. There were always plausible explanations, always someone to blame. But now I saw the pattern as clear as day. He'd always been this way. He'd just gotten better at hiding it. Jennifer found me one night in the garage, surrounded by boxes of papers and old photos, trying to piece together my brother's story like a sinister jigsaw puzzle. She sat beside me on the cold concrete floor and held my hand. She told me I was wasting my time, that I needed to find a balance or I would go crazy. She was right. I knew it. I was sleeping 3 or 4 hours a night, had lost nearly 20 pounds, and was irritable and distracted all the time. But how could I just move on when so many people were suffering because of what Marcus did? How could I rest knowing he was out there, free, probably continuing to rob others? The financial situation at home was becoming increasingly desperate. I received a formal notice from the bank threatening to foreclose on the house if I didn't pay the 3 months' arrears, a total of $6,400 that I simply didn't have. Jennifer started tutoring in the evenings after work, earning an extra $200 a week that barely covered food. We had to ask her parents for help, something that filled me with profound shame. They loaned us $2,000, all they could afford, without jeopardizing their own finances. My parents wanted to help, but were in the same situation as me, struggling to recover from Marcus's theft. It was a constant humiliation to have to admit that I couldn't provide for my own family. I started working as an Uber driver on nights and weekends, anything to bring in extra cash. I'd drive for hours in the perpetual Portland rain, chatting with strangers about their lives while mine fell apart. There were surreal moments when I'd pick up passengers going to fancy restaurants, parties, events, living their normal lives with no idea of the hell I was going through. Envy doesn't describe what I felt. It wasn't envy, exactly, but more of a deep mourning for the life I'd planned that had been stolen from me. Every dollar I earned driving drunks home at 2 a.m. was a visceral reminder of how Marcus had destroyed me. One night, after a particularly long drive to the airport with a couple, I parked my car in an empty parking lot and simply cried. I cried for everything I had lost, for the company I had built with so much sacrifice that was now just a memory, for the trust I would never have in anyone again, for the relationship with my brother that I discovered was an elaborate lie. I cried for my parents who were suffering the impossible pain of having one child destroy the other. I cried for Jennifer, who deserved so much better than a financially and emotionally broken husband. When I finally ran out of tears, I sat there in the silence of the car, watching the rain pound against the windshield, feeling completely empty. It was in this moment of utter despair that I received a call that would change everything. It was Thomas Bradford, my lawyer, calling at 11 o'clock on a Friday night. He never called outside of business hours unless it was extremely urgent. My heart raced as I answered. He got straight to the point. The Las Vegas police had found Vanessa Rodriguez. She'd been arrested during a casino raid where she was using fake identities to open fraudulent lines of credit. When they ran a background check and saw the arrest warrant related to our case, they arrested her immediately. And she was willing to make a deal. She was willing to hand over Marcus in exchange for a reduced sentence. Bradford explained that Vanessa was looking at least 8 years in prison for the crimes she committed against us, plus the new charges in Nevada. But if she cooperated fully, provided evidence, and testified against Marcus, the prosecutor was willing to reduce it to 3 years. She had told investigators that she knew exactly where Marcus was, that they were still in contact, and that she had information about offshore bank accounts where he had hidden some of the stolen money. Bradford said this was exactly what we needed, the missing piece to finally bring Marcus to justice. He asked if I was comfortable with the deal being offered to Vanessa. I didn't hesitate for a second. Yes, I said, take the deal. I want my brother arrested. In the following days, Vanessa began to sing like a bird. She told everything to the federal investigators who had now officially taken over the case. Marcus was living in Reno, Nevada, using an assumed name, working as a bartender at a small casino. He had grown a beard, dyed his hair blonde, and completely changed his appearance. Most of the stolen money, approximately $280,000, was in 2 accounts in the Cayman Islands that he had opened through shell companies. Vanessa provided account numbers, passwords, and documents that proved it all. She also revealed something that absolutely sickened me. They had planned another major scam, targeting older people with Alzheimer's or dementia, exploiting their cognitive vulnerability to steal their life savings. The calculated coldness of it all was breathtaking. These weren't just crimes of opportunity or impulsive decisions. This was systematic, planned predation, executed with surgical precision. Marcus and Vanessa sat together and chose their victims like a hunter chooses prey, analyzing who had the most money, who was most vulnerable, who would be least likely to quickly uncover the scam. They kept detailed spreadsheets with information about each mark, how much money they had, and what the best approach was. When I saw copies of these spreadsheets Vanessa gave to investigators, I found my own name there. Next to it was written, "Primary target, complete trust, vulnerable due to new business, potential 80K. I was just an entry in an Excel spreadsheet for my own brother. The FBI mounted an operation to arrest Marcus in Reno. Bradford called me and asked if I wanted to be there when it happened. Part of me desperately wanted to see the moment he was handcuffed, to see his face when he realized it was over. But another part, the part that still held some remnants of the brotherly love I felt, couldn't bear the thought of being there. I decided not to go. He told Bradford he trusted the FBI to do its job. The truth was, I was afraid of what I might do or say if I saw Marcus face to face. I was afraid of discovering that all the love I'd felt for him for 32 years had turned to pure hatred. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning. 6 federal agents entered the tiny apartment where Marcus was living, a squalid place in a bad area of Reno that cost $700 a month, completely different from the life he was used to. Bradford called me soon afterward to say it had been peaceful, without resistance. Marcus didn't even try to deny it or run. When they said Vanessa had turned him in, he apparently just bowed his head and accepted it. He was taken to the federal station in handcuffs, processed, and denied bail as a flight risk. He would be held until trial. When I hung up the phone after that call, I felt a strange mix of relief, sadness, and something I couldn't quite name. Justice was beginning to be served, but why didn't I feel better? News of Marcus's arrest spread quickly among all the victims. My phone rang non-stop for days with people wanting details, expressing relief, sharing their complex emotions about the developments in the case. Margaret Bloom, the 72-year-old woman, called me crying, but this time they were tears of gratitude mixed with sadness. She said she could finally sleep at night, knowing that this man could never do this to anyone else. But she also confessed that she felt sorry for him, that she wondered how someone could lose themselves so much in life that they would do such terrible things. Her compassion, even after everything he had suffered, humbled me. I lacked that generosity of spirit at that moment. I could only feel anger. My parents received the news devastatingly. I called them as soon as I heard about the arrest, not wanting them to find out on television or through third parties. My mother answered the phone, and when I told her, she was silent for a long time. Then she said simply, her voice breaking, "My baby is in jail." It didn't matter that Marcus was 36 years old. It didn't matter that he was a criminal who had destroyed lives. To her, he was still her son, her baby. It broke me in a way I hadn't expected. My father picked up the phone and said they needed time alone to process everything. I heard my mother crying in the background before he hung up. I drove to Eugene the next day and found my parents completely devastated, as if they had aged a decade overnight. We sat in the same living room where I'd told him the truth about Marcus months ago. My father's eyes were red and puffy, and it was obvious he'd been crying, something I'd only seen once in my life, at his own father's funeral. He asked me if I thought Marcus had any chance of avoiding prison, if there was any possibility of a plea deal. I had to be brutally honest. I explained that with all the evidence Vanessa had provided, plus the statements from 17 victims, plus the bank records from the offshore accounts, Marcus was looking at somewhere between 10 and 20 years in federal prison. There was no way out of that. I saw my father close his eyes and pinch the bridge of his nose, trying to control his emotions. My mother got up and left the room, unable to listen any longer. Jennifer, who had come with me, followed my mother. I was left alone with my father for the first time since everything began. He finally spoke, his voice low and full of pain. He said he had failed as a father, that he should have seen the signs, that he should have been more present, more attentive. I tried to argue that it wasn't his fault, that Marcus was an adult who made his own conscious choices. But my father shook his head. He told me something he had never shared with me before. When Marcus was 15, he was caught stealing money from my mother's purse. My father confronted him. Marcus cried, apologized, and promised never to do it again. My father decided not to tell my mother, not to make a big deal out of it, and gave her a second chance. Now he blamed himself for not being stricter at that crucial moment. I told my father that I couldn't torture myself with what I could have done differently. Marcus had every opportunity in the world, a loving family, a good education, and the example of hard-working, honest parents. He chose a different path not out of necessity or desperation, but out of greed and a lack of character. My father heard my words, but I could see they didn't fully sink in. A father's guilt for a wayward son is something too deep, etched at a level that logic cannot reach. We embraced there in the living room, two men broken by the betrayal of the same person, united in grief, but unable to truly comfort each other because each wound was different, each loss unique. In the following weeks, the legal process began to move forward. Marcus was formally indicted on 19 separate charges: wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement, and others. Each charge carried potential years in prison. His public defender, an overworked and visibly tired man named James Peterson, contacted Thomas Bradford, seeking to negotiate some sort of plea agreement. Bradford consulted with all the victims before responding. Most, myself included, said we didn't want any deal. We wanted the case to go to trial. We wanted everything to be exposed publicly. We wanted Marcus to face each of his victims and hear the impact of his actions. The federal prosecutor, a tough and experienced woman named Amanda Chen, was more than happy to take the case to trial. She told the victims at a meeting that she had an absolutely solid case against Marcus and that he would be an example, a clear message that white-collar crime would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. She showed slides with flowcharts of the money transfers, the shell companies, the offshore accounts. It was complex, but indisputable. Marcus had left a crystal-clear paper trail, probably because he never imagined he would be caught, or perhaps because his arrogance made him believe he was too smart for the authorities. Vanessa was right in one thing she had told investigators. Marcus always thought he was the smartest one in the room. I received a letter from prison about 6 weeks after Marcus's arrest. I recognized the handwriting on the envelope before I even opened it. My first reaction was to throw it in the trash without reading it, but Jennifer encouraged me to at least see what he had to say. The letter was 3 pages long and handwritten. He began with generic apologies, saying he was ashamed, that he didn't know how he got to that point, that he understood if I could never forgive him. Then he got more specific, trying to explain how he met Vanessa, how she convinced him that what they were doing wasn't really that bad, that rich people could lose some money. He tried to portray himself as her victim too, manipulated and seduced by a seasoned criminal. The part that angered me the most was when Marcus wrote that he had always loved me as a brother, that he never specifically wanted to hurt me, that I was different from the other victims. As if that made any difference, as if stealing from his own brother with love in his heart made the crime less heinous. He ended the letter by asking me to visit him in prison, saying he needed to look me in the eye and apologize in person, that he needed a chance to explain everything face to face. He also casually mentioned that our parents hadn't come to visit him yet and asked if I could convince them too. His audacity knew no bounds. I tore the letter into small pieces and threw it in the trash. There was nothing he could say that I wanted to hear, but the letter haunted me for days afterward. Despite all the anger and hatred I felt, there was a small, stubborn part of me that still remembered the brother Marcus used to be, or the one I thought he was. I remembered when he taught me to ride a bike at 5, running alongside me, holding the seat until I regained my balance. I remembered when he defended me from a bully at school, getting punched in the nose, but making the guy leave me alone. I remembered the nights we'd stay up talking about our dreams and plans for the future. These memories were real to me, with weight and substance, but were they real to him? Or was I just a long-term investment, someone being groomed to be exploited decades later? Jennifer sensed my inner struggle. One night, as we lay in bed, unable to sleep, she asked if I was considering visiting Marcus. I admitted I was confused, torn between what my anger told me to do and what some remnant of family bond whispered. She was wise as always. She told me there was no right or wrong answer, that I needed to do what brought me the most peace, not what other people expected. If visiting Marcus helped me find some kind of closure, then perhaps it was worth it. But if it would only open wounds and give him a platform for further manipulation, then there was no point in going. I thanked her for her wisdom and promised to think carefully before deciding anything. Meanwhile, my financial situation began to show small signs of improvement. With Marcus's arrest and the evidence regarding the offshore accounts, the FBI had frozen all the assets they could track. Bradford explained that there was about $280,000 that would eventually be distributed among the victims proportionally to what each lost. It wasn't all. There was at least $120,000 left that Marcus had already spent on his life of luxury and that we would probably never recover. The community of victims had become a strange makeshift family. We spoke regularly, supported each other, shared information and updates. David Hernandez, the insurance investigator, had become a close friend. He and his wife invited us to dinner a few times, and during those times we were able to talk about things other than Marcus, just have normal conversations about life, work, hobbies. They were rare oases of normalcy amidst the constant chaos that had become my existence. Margaret Bloom sent me encouraging cards in the mail every week, small, handwritten messages reminding me that better days were ahead. Her kindness, especially considering she had lost more than I, was inspiring. The trial date was set for April, approximately 8 months after Marcus's arrest. Bradford explained that it would be a long process, probably 3 to 4 weeks long. The prosecution would call all the victims to testify, plus Vanessa, who was the star witness against Marcus. Financial experts would explain the technical details of the transfers and offshore accounts. It would be exhausting, but necessary. Bradford asked me if I was ready to sit on the witness stand and tell my story to a room full of strangers, with Marcus sitting there staring at me. Honestly, I didn't know if I was ready, but I knew it was something I had to do, not just for myself, but for everyone Marcus had hurt. I began preparing my testimony with Bradford's help. We reviewed every detail of my interaction with Marcus, every document, every conversation. Bradford taught me techniques for staying calm on the witness stand, how to handle difficult questions from the defense attorney, how to focus on the facts without letting emotions completely take over. These were intense and emotionally draining sessions. Every time I told the story again, I relived the initial trauma of discovering the betrayal. But Bradford insisted that the more I practiced, the more natural and believable my testimony would be. He was right, but that didn't make the process any less painful. Each preparation session left me exhausted, requiring hours to recover emotionally. 3 months before the trial, I received an unexpected call from James Peterson, Marcus's attorney. He said Marcus wanted to make a plea deal, admitting guilt to all charges in exchange for a lighter sentence recommendation. Peterson explained that Marcus had finally accepted the reality of his situation, that a trial would only prolong everyone's suffering and likely result in an even harsher sentence. He was willing to make a full statement in court, publicly apologize to each victim, and provide any additional information about hidden assets that had not yet been discovered. In exchange, he wanted the prosecutor to recommend 12 years in prison instead of the potential 20. Peterson's call left me deeply confused. On the one hand, 12 years was still a significant sentence. Marcus would be nearly 50 when he got out of prison. On the other hand, it seemed short compared to the damage he had caused to so many lives. I told Peterson that I needed to consult with the other victims before giving any answers. He understood and said he would await our collective decision. After hanging up, I sat on the couch for an hour trying to process what this meant. A plea deal would eliminate the trial, which meant I wouldn't have to take the witness stand and publicly relive the trauma. But it also meant Marcus wouldn't face the full justice process, wouldn't hear each victim tell their story in detail. I organized an emergency meeting with all available victims in the same community room where we first met. 15 of the 17 victims attended. 2 were unable to attend but cast their votes by phone. The discussion was intense and emotional. Margaret Bloom, surprisingly, was one of the first to speak in favor of the agreement. She said she was 72 years old, that her health was not optimal, and that the idea of spending weeks in court, constantly reliving her trauma, was more than she could bear. She wanted closure. She wanted to move on with what was left of her life. Several others agreed, especially the older ones, who saw the trial as too heavy a burden to bear. But David Hernandez had a strong opposing opinion. He argued that accepting the plea deal was letting Marcus off too easily, that 12 years wasn't enough for what he did. He said we needed to think not only of ourselves, but of future victims of similar criminals. If Marcus received a lighter sentence for making a plea deal, it would send the wrong message to other financial predators. The young couple, who had lost their down payment on their first home, vehemently agreed. His wife, Rachel, was tearful, saying that Marcus had destroyed their dream of owning a home, which they would now be renting for additional years because of his greed. She wanted him to pay in full for what he had done. The discussion continued for nearly 3 hours. Each person shared their perspective, their feelings, and their needs. What became clear was that no consensus was possible. We were split almost down the middle, with some wanting to accept the settlement for the sake of quick closure, others wanting complete justice, regardless of the emotional toll. Eventually, we decided that each victim would speak with Amanda Chen, the federal prosecutor, individually about their preferences. Chen would make the final decision based on what would be best for the case as a whole, considering all factors. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best we could do given the complexity of the situation and the diversity of our needs. I had my conversation with Amanda Chen 2 days later in her downtown Portland office. She was a striking woman, perhaps 40, with a presence that commanded immediate respect. She had prosecuted financial crimes for 15 years and clearly knew her craft. She asked directly what I wanted to see happen. I was honest with her. I told her I was torn. That part of me wanted to see Marcus face the full trial process, but another part was exhausted and just wanted it to be over. Chen listened attentively, taking occasional notes. Then she shared her professional perspective. She said that financial fraud cases with a plea bargain were extremely rare because they required the defendant to publicly admit complete guilt, which would be permanently on the record. Chen explained that if Marcus took the plea deal, he would have to appear in open court and confess in detail to each crime, admitting that he understood he was committing fraud and that he knew he was harming innocent people. He would have to hear victim impact statements from every victim who wanted to speak. It wouldn't be a quick or painless process for him. The difference would be that there wouldn't be weeks of technical testimony, legal arguments, or detailed forensic examinations. Chen said she was personally inclined to accept the plea deal because it guaranteed a 100% certainty of conviction, eliminated any possibility of lengthy appeals, and would still result in a decade in prison for Marcus. She also mentioned that government resources were limited, and accepting this plea deal would allow her to focus on other equally important cases. I asked Chen about the possibility that Marcus was just putting on airs, accepting the plea deal to appear remorseful, but without true remorse. She smiled sadly and said that was always possible, that she couldn't read people's hearts. But from a legal standpoint, it didn't matter whether the remorse was genuine or not. What mattered was that Marcus would be a convicted felon, would lose his civil rights, would spend over a decade behind bars, and would have his name permanently tarnished. His life as he knew it would be over regardless of his inner feelings. That made sense to me in a way I hadn't expected. Maybe I was looking for something that wasn't there, some kind of redemption or genuine transformation from Marcus. Maybe all I could realistically hope for was that he would pay a concrete price for his actions. I left Chen's office feeling slightly more at peace with the idea of the plea bargain. I spoke at length with Jennifer that night. She asked me difficult questions no one else had asked. She asked what I truly wanted to achieve with all of this. Revenge, justice, closure, financial restoration, protection of future victims. Each goal potentially led to different decisions. I realized I wanted all of these simultaneously, which was impossible. I needed to prioritize. After much reflection, I concluded that the most important thing for me was to ensure Marcus couldn't do this to anyone else for a long time, and to recover as much of the stolen money as possible. The plea bargain achieved both objectives reasonably well. I called Chen the next day and told her I supported the plea agreement. She thanked me for my input and said that after speaking with all the victims, most were inclined to accept. There were a few, including David and the young couple, who were still strongly opposed. But Chen decided that accepting the agreement was the right course of action, considering all factors. The agreement was formally presented to the federal judge overseeing the case, the Honorable Patricia Whitmore, a judge known for her tough stance on white-collar crime. She would review the terms and decide whether or not to accept it. Federal judges were not required to accept plea agreements if they found the terms inadequate. There was a real chance that Whitmore would reject it and insist on a full trial. 2 weeks passed in anxiety as we awaited Judge Whitmore's decision. During that time, something unexpected happened. My mother called me saying she had visited Marcus in prison. I was shocked because she had repeatedly said she couldn't see him, that it was too painful. But apparently maternal guilt and a mother's unconditional love eventually won out. She went alone, without telling my father or me until afterward. The visit had lasted an hour, and she said Marcus had cried almost the entire time. He begged her forgiveness, told her he was ashamed, that he understood if she could never look at him the same way again. My mother, being who she was, had held his hands through the glass and told him she would always be his mother, that she would always love him, even if she didn't approve of or understand his actions. Part of me was angry with my mother for giving in so easily. Marcus didn't deserve her forgiveness, not after everything he'd done not only to me, but to his own parents. But another part understood. A mother's love is something different, operating on a frequency that doesn't follow logic or justice. She could simultaneously love her son and abhor his actions. I asked if Marcus had mentioned anything about the money he'd stolen from them. My mother said yes, he'd promised to pay back every penny when he got out of prison, that he'd spend the rest of his life making amends. I mentally rolled my eyes. Marcus making promises, the same thing he'd always done so well. But I told my mother I respected her decision to visit him, that she needed to do what her heart told her. My father, on the other hand, stood his ground. He clearly stated that he had no interest in seeing Marcus, that his son had died the day he chose to become a criminal. It was a harsh, final statement. My mother tried to convince him a few times to reconsider, but he was adamant. I could see the conflict tearing my parents in different directions, my mother pulled by unconditional maternal love, my father trapped in a toxic mix of disappointment, shame, and anger. Their 42-year marriage was under immense strain because of Marcus's actions. They argued more than I had ever seen in my life, small tensions exploding into arguments over unrelated matters. Marcus was destroying our family even from prison. Judge Whitmore's decision came on a cold February morning. Chen called me personally to inform me. Whitmore had accepted the plea deal, but with harsher conditions than originally proposed. Instead of 12 years, she would sentence Marcus to 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release. In addition, Marcus would have to pay full restitution of $415,000, the total amount stolen from all victims plus interest. If he failed to pay the remaining frozen assets, the debt would follow him after his release from prison, with his finances monitored for the rest of his life. Whitmore had made clear in her written decision that she considered Marcus's crimes particularly heinous because they involved betrayal of family trust, exploitation of the elderly, and calculated predation. Jen said Marcus accepted the harsher terms without hesitation. His attorney, Peterson, had advised him to accept because the alternative of going to trial would likely result in an even longer sentence, possibly 25 years. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks from now. It would be an opportunity for all victims who wanted to make impact statements. Chen strongly encouraged me to prepare something. He said it was therapeutic for many victims to be able to speak directly to the perpetrator and the judge about how their lives had been affected. I promised I would think about it. Hanging up the phone, I felt strangely empty. 15 years seemed simultaneously too long and not enough. Marcus would be 51 when he was released. He still had decades of life ahead of him. The lives he ruined would never be completely restored. I spent the next few days trying to decide whether to make a statement at the sentencing hearing. Jennifer encouraged me, telling me I would regret it if I didn't take the opportunity. David Hernandez also called to say he would definitely make a statement and hoped I would too. He said it was important for Marcus to hear from me specifically, his own brother, the devastating impact of his actions. Eventually I agreed. I began writing and rewriting my statement, trying to capture in words the indescribable trauma of the past few months. How do you summarize in a few paragraphs the destruction of trust, the loss of dreams, the constant weight of financial stress, the humiliation of having to borrow money, the sleepless nights, the panic attacks? My first version was very angry, full of accusations and harsh language. Jennifer helped me soften it without losing the essential truth. I needed to find the balance between legitimately expressing my pain and anger without sounding merely vengeful. I wanted Judge Whitmore, who had already sentenced Marcus but would still preside over the formal hearing, to fully understand the human cost of his crimes. I wanted Marcus, if he still had any capacity for shame or genuine remorse, to understand that he had destroyed more than just bank accounts. He had destroyed relationships, trust, dreams, the very fabric of a family. I revised my statement at least 20 times, each version capturing a different aspect of the trauma. The morning of the sentencing hearing arrived with a typical Portland grey sky, a light rain falling steadily. Jennifer and I arrived at the federal courthouse early, wanting to avoid crowds and have time to calm down before the proceedings began. The building was imposing, all stone and glass, with that solemn atmosphere only federal courts can achieve. We passed through security and ascended to the courtroom on the 4th floor. Other victims were already arriving, all formally dressed, their faces tense and serious. We greeted each other discreetly, united by our shared experience, but each carrying their own specific weight of pain and expectation. Margaret Bloom was sitting alone on one of the hallway benches when we arrived. She wore a simple navy blue dress and held a cane she hadn't had when I met her. Jennifer went over to her immediately and took her hand. Margaret smiled shyly and said she was nervous, that she had written and rewritten her statement so many times she knew it by heart. She asked if I thought Marcus truly understood what he had done, or if he was just following his lawyer's advice to minimize his sentence. I replied honestly that I didn't know, that we might never know what was really going on in his head. Some criminals genuinely feel remorse, others just regret getting caught. I wasn't sure which category Marcus fell into. David Hernandez arrived minutes later with his wife, Elena. He carried a thick folder filled with documents, ever the meticulous investigator. He said he had prepared a detailed 20-minute statement that included not only the personal impact, but also an analysis of Marcus's manipulative tactics and how others could protect themselves from similar predators. It was typical of David to turn his pain into something constructive, educational. Elena hugged Jennifer, and they began talking quietly, offering mutual support. The hallway gradually filled with more victims, some with family, others alone. It was a strange, somber gathering of people who would never have met under normal circumstances. At 9:45, a court official opened the courtroom doors. We filed in silently, finding seats on the polished wooden benches. The room was large, with a high ceiling and that sense of historical weight that places of justice carry. The United States coat of arms hung behind the judge's chair, reminding everyone that this was more than just a personal dispute. It was society demanding accountability from one of its members who had broken the social contract. I sat in the second row with Jennifer on my left and David on my right. My parents had decided not to come, saying it would be too painful. I respected their decision, though part of me wished they were there. At 10 o'clock sharp, Marcus was ushered in through a side door. My stomach clenched when I saw him. He was unrecognizable. He'd lost at least 30 pounds, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken with dark circles beneath. The beard he'd grown to disguise himself in Reno was shaved, revealing his familiar but worn features. He wore an orange prison jumpsuit with handcuffs at his wrists and ankles, walking with small, shuffling steps. When his eyes swept the room and found me, I saw something that looked like genuine pain cross his face. Or maybe it was just embarrassment at being seen in that state. I looked away, unable to maintain eye contact. Marcus was seated at the defense table next to James Peterson, his public defender. Amanda Chen, the prosecutor, was at the other table with neat stacks of documents. Everyone rose when Judge Whitmore entered, a woman in her 60s with short grey hair and an expression that conveyed no emotion. She sat down, banged her gavel once, and the hearing officially began. Whitmore began by reviewing the terms of the plea agreement Marcus had accepted, reading each charge aloud. Wire fraud, 17 counts. Money laundering, 6 counts. Conspiracy to commit fraud, 1 count. The list seemed endless, each item a reminder of the scope of Marcus's criminality. When Whitmore finished reading the charges, he turned to Marcus and asked him directly if he understood each one and if he was admitting guilt freely, without coercion. Marcus stood, helped by Peterson, and replied hoarsely, "Yes, Your Honor." Whitmore then asked if he understood that he was waiving his right to a trial and that the sentence would be final, with no possibility of appeal based on the admission of guilt. Again, Marcus answered in the affirmative. There was something profoundly surreal about hearing my brother, the person I grew up with, formally admit to being a convicted felon. I felt Jennifer's hands tighten around mine, anchoring me to the reality of the moment. Whitmore then opened the session for victim impact statements. Chen had previously coordinated who would speak and in what order. Margaret Bloom would be first. She rose slowly, leaning on her cane, and walked to the podium in the center of the room. Her hand trembled, holding the papers for her statement. She began by talking about how she had met Marcus, how kind he had been to her, helping her with tasks that her age no longer allowed her to easily perform. She described how he had gained her trust over the months before proposing the investment. Her voice was steady despite the tears that had begun to flow silently. Then she described the impact of losing her life savings, the $53,000 that represented decades of work and careful saving. Margaret told the room that she had postponed a necessary hip surgery because she no longer had the money to pay for the portion her insurance didn't cover. She described the constant pain she experienced, how difficult it was to walk, how she had lost her independence and now depended on neighbors for basic things like going to the grocery store. Her voice broke as she said, "I trusted you, Marcus. You were like a grandson to me. How could someone do this to an elderly person? How do you sleep at night knowing you caused so much suffering?" I looked at Marcus and saw tears streaming down his face. I don't know if they were tears of genuine remorse or self-pity. Perhaps he didn't even know. Margaret concluded her statement by saying that she forgave Marcus because she didn't want to carry hatred in her heart, but that he needed to understand that forgiveness didn't eliminate consequences. David Hernandez was next. His statement was more analytical, as expected. He methodically detailed the manipulative tactics Marcus used, the warning signs that were now obvious in retrospect but were skillfully disguised in the moment. He explained how Marcus had identified that he had received a large bonus at work and was looking for ways to invest. He described the fake spreadsheets, the confident promises, the calculated charm. David then focused on the emotional impact, how the betrayal had affected his ability to trust people, how he now saw hidden motives in innocent interactions. He said Marcus hadn't just stolen money, he had stolen his ability to see the best in people. It was a different kind of theft, invisible, but no less devastating. 5 more victims gave statements, each adding another layer of understanding to the human toll of Marcus's crimes. A young couple, Rachel and Tom Patterson, spoke of their deferred dream of owning their first home, how they would now have to wait at least another 5 years to save up for a down payment. Rachel was 7 months pregnant and tearfully said her baby would be born in a tiny rented apartment instead of the house they had planned, all because Marcus decided his greed was more important than the future of a young family. A man named Robert Chen, no relation to prosecutor Amanda Chen, described how he had invested his 3 children's education fund. Then it was my turn. I stood, my legs trembling slightly. Jennifer squeezed my hand one last time before letting go. I walked to the podium, each step feeling like it weighed a ton. I placed my papers on the wooden surface and looked up. The entire room was utterly silent, all eyes on me. I avoided looking directly at Marcus, focusing on a neutral point above his head. I took a deep breath and began. "Your Excellency, my name is Daniel Carter, and the man sitting there is, or was, my brother." My voice came out stronger than I expected, steady despite the emotional storm raging inside me. I felt a small sense of pride in that. I continued my statement by describing our childhood together, setting the context for the relationship Marcus had explored. I talked about how he was my hero as a child, my protector, my mentor. I described the day I started my company and how Marcus offered his help, how I didn't hesitate for a second to trust him because he was my brother, my flesh and blood. Then I recounted in detail the discovery of the fraud, the trip to Seattle to find an office that didn't exist, the empty house, the disappearance. My voice began to crack as I described the impact on my life, the destroyed company, the accumulated debts, the employees I had to lay off, the nights driving Ubers at 3 a.m. trying to pay bills. Jennifer was crying silently in the audience, but I kept my focus. The hardest part of my statement was describing the impact on our parents. I told how my mother developed severe insomnia and anxiety, how she had to start taking medication for the first time in her life. I described my father, always a pillar of strength, shutting down emotionally, isolating himself from the world, visibly aging in a matter of months. I said that Marcus hadn't just stolen from me, he'd stolen from his own parents, the people who raised him with love and sacrifice, who always believed in him, who were now living their golden years in anguish and shame because of his actions. I saw Marcus cover his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. I felt no sympathy. I finished my statement, looking directly at Marcus for the first time. "You're not my brother anymore, Marcus. My brother died the day you decided your greed was more important than your family. The person sitting there is a stranger who happens to share my DNA. I hope the next 15 years give you enough time to understand the magnitude of what you did. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't expect reconciliation. I just hope you can never do this to anyone else again." My voice was firm again at the end, full of conviction. I gathered my papers and returned to my seat. Jennifer hugged me immediately, whispering that it had been perfect, that she was proud of me. I was shaking, adrenaline flooding my system. After 3 more victim impact statements, it was Marcus's turn to speak. Whitmore gave him the opportunity to make a final statement before the sentence was formally imposed. Peterson counseled him briefly in a whisper before Marcus stood. He was clearly nervous, wiping his hands repeatedly on his prison uniform pants. He began in a low voice that Whitmore had to ask him to raise. Marcus apologized generically, saying there were no words to express his regret and shame. He acknowledged that he had destroyed lives, betrayed trust, and caused immeasurable suffering. He said he thought about his victims every day, that their faces haunted him constantly. Then Marcus did something I hadn't expected. He turned directly to me, breaking normal court protocol, and said, "Danny, I know you said I'm not your brother anymore, and I understand that completely. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that everything we went through together as children was real to me. I truly loved you as a brother. I don't know when or how I lost myself, but I know what I did is unforgivable. I will spend the next 15 years, and probably the rest of my life, trying to understand how I became this person. I just want you to have the happy life you deserve. I'm sorry. I destroyed so much." His voice broke at the end, and he sat up quickly, covering his face. Part of me wanted to believe it was genuine, but the larger part, the part that had been betrayed so completely, suspected it was just another performance. Judge Whitmore waited for complete silence to return to the courtroom before speaking. She adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Marcus with an expression that mixed disappointment and determination. She began by saying that in her 23 years on the federal bench, she had seen hundreds of cases of financial fraud, but that few had affected her as much as this one. She explained that what made Marcus's crimes particularly repugnant was not only the monetary value stolen, but the systematic exploitation of trust, especially of family members and vulnerable elderly people. She said that crimes like these corroded the very fabric of society, making people lose faith in human kindness and suspicious of even those closest to them. Whitmore then detailed the sentence: 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release, to be served in a medium security facility. Marcus would have to complete every day of those 15 years. There was no plea bargain, no reduction for good behavior, because federal prisons didn't work that way. After release, he would have 3 years of supervised release with strict restrictions on his financial activities. He would have to report any bank accounts, any employment, any change of address. He could not work in any position that involved handling other people's money. The restitution order was $415,000 plus compound interest, calculated from the date of each theft, totaling approximately $462,000. Whitmore explained that the already frozen assets, totaling $283,000, would be immediately distributed to the victims pro rata. The remainder, $179,000, would be a debt that would follow Marcus for the rest of his life. Any money he earned after his release from prison would be garnished by 75% until the debt was completely paid. If Marcus died before paying everything, the debt would be collected from any assets he left behind. Whitmore was absolutely clear. Marcus would pay for his crimes not only with years of freedom, but with his ability to lead a normal financial life for the rest of his life. It was a devastating and far-reaching sentence that guaranteed lasting consequences far beyond 15 years in prison. Marcus listened with his head bowed, without visibly reacting. When Whitmore finished and banged the gavel, finalizing the sentence, he simply nodded slightly. The bailiffs approached to take him back. That's when he looked at me one last time. There was something in his eyes, a silent plea that I couldn't or wouldn't interpret. I kept my face neutral, giving him no indication of forgiveness or compassion. He was led out the side door, disappearing from view. I felt a huge weight lift from my shoulders simultaneously, with a deep sadness settling in my chest. It was over. Marcus was going to prison for 15 years. My brother, or whoever he used to be, was truly lost forever. Outside the courthouse, victims gathered on the steps of the building despite the light rain that continued to fall. There was a strange feeling in the group, not exactly of celebration, but of collective relief. Margaret Bloom hugged me, saying I had been strong and eloquent. David squeezed my hand firmly, his eyes shining with unexpressed emotion. Amanda Chen came to speak to us all, explaining that the frozen funds would be processed and distributed within 6 to 8 weeks. She said her office would be in touch, and that if there were any problems, or if Marcus attempted to violate the terms of his sentence in any way, we should contact her immediately. We thanked her for her dedication to the case. Her expertise had been impressive. Jennifer and I drove in silence for the first 10 minutes home. The rain had intensified, the windshield wipers squealing steadily. Finally, she asked how I was feeling. I tried to articulate the jumble of emotions: relief that Marcus was finally facing real consequences, sadness at the definitive loss of the relationship we had, or thought we had, residual anger that would probably never completely disappear, strange guilt at feeling satisfaction in seeing my own brother taken to prison, deep exhaustion from having carried that weight for so many months. Jennifer listened without judgment, holding my free hand as I drove. She told me that everything I was feeling was valid, that there was no instruction manual for processing betrayal of that magnitude. When we got home, we found a message on the phone. It was my mother. Her voice sounded frail and tired. She'd seen news about the sentencing online. The case had received some local media coverage, given the substantial amount involved and the nature of the family fraud. My mother urged me to call her back when I could, saying she needed to talk. I took a deep breath before returning the call, bracing myself for another emotionally draining conversation. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. She asked how the hearing had gone, if Marcus had spoken, what he looked like. I answered her questions objectively, without embellishing them, but also without adding my own negative interpretation. My mother then confessed something that surprised me. She said she was relieved it was all over, that the uncertainty and waiting had been excruciating. 15 years was a long time. She would probably be in her 80s by the time Marcus left, assuming she lived that long. But at least now there was clarity, a definite end to that horrible time. She asked if I thought Marcus had been sincere in his apology. I didn't want to lie to her, but I also didn't want to completely destroy any hope she might have had. I said Marcus certainly seemed to be suffering, but only time would tell if it was genuine remorse or just the consequences being too much to bear. My mother sighed heavily and said she would pray for him every day, that she would never stop being his mother, no matter what she did. My father was having a completely different reaction. When I spoke to him later that day, he sounded almost triumphant. He said justice had been served, that Marcus was finally paying the price for his horrific actions. He expressed no sadness at the loss of his son to the prison system, only satisfaction that the system had worked. The dichotomy between my parents was stark and troubling. They were processing the same event in diametrically opposed ways, and it was creating a rift in their relationship that I feared would never be fully repaired. Marcus had even damaged their marriage, a union that had survived 42 years of life as normal challenges, but was now reeling under the weight of this extraordinary betrayal. Over the next few weeks, I tried to establish some semblance of normalcy in my life. With the promise of my refund arriving soon, I began making cautious plans for the future. $43,000 wouldn't be enough to restart my construction company, but it would be enough to pay off the most pressing debts, pay off the mortgage, and have a small safety cushion. I continued working as an Uber driver and began looking for a job as a civil engineer, something I'd never considered before because I'd always wanted to be my own boss. But dreams needed to be adjusted to reality, and my reality was that I needed stability and a guaranteed income. Jennifer mentioned the possibility of having children again. We'd postponed it because of the financial crisis, but she was approaching 35 and worried about her biological clock ticking. I had to be honest with her. She said we weren't financially ready to have children yet, that we'd need at least another year to fully stabilize. But the deeper truth, the one that was harder to admit, was that I was terrified of bringing a child into such a broken family. How would I explain to my son or daughter that they had an uncle in prison for 15 years for stealing from dozens of people, including their own father? How would I protect a child from the knowledge that people you trust completely can betray you in the most devastating way? Jennifer understood my concerns, but argued that we couldn't let Marcus's actions control all our life decisions. She was right. I knew that, of course. But emotionally, I was still stuck, still processing the trauma, still learning to trust again. We promised to revisit the conversation in 6 months, to give myself time to heal a little more. Jennifer agreed, though I could see the disappointment in her eyes. It was just another way Marcus had stolen from me, not just money, but life experiences, important milestones, the natural timeline I had envisioned for my life. Every decision postponed, every dream put on hold, was his posthumous victory over me, and I hated it. The restitution money arrived 7 weeks after the ruling, exactly as Amanda Chen had predicted. $43,317 electronically transferred to my bank account. Seeing that amount on my statement was surreal. It wasn't nearly enough to undo all the damage, but it was something concrete, an acknowledgement that I had been wronged and that society was trying to make amends. My first action was to pay off the mortgage arrears, eliminating the threat of foreclosure that had hung over us for months. The relief of knowing we wouldn't lose our home was indescribable. Jennifer wept with gratitude when I confirmed the payment. It was the first genuinely good news we had had in almost a year. I used part of the money to pay back Jennifer's parents' loan with interest, even though they said it wasn't necessary. It was a matter of dignity and respect. I paid suppliers I'd owed, restoring my reputation in the local construction community. I wouldn't be able to rebuild my company immediately, but at least my name was no longer in the mud. I saved $15,000 as an emergency fund, something Jennifer and I had never had before. The rest went towards smaller debts accumulated during the months of crisis. In the end, we were back to square one financially, no longer drowning in debt, but also without much left. It was progress, but it was a constant reminder of where I would be if Marcus hadn't stolen from me. David Hernandez called me a few weeks after the restitution payment. He had an idea he wanted to discuss with me. He suggested we create a non-profit focused on educating people about financial fraud, especially those perpetrated by acquaintances and family members. He said our collective experience as Marcus's victims could be transformed into something constructive, into a legacy of awareness and prevention. The idea immediately intrigued me. It would be a way to give meaning to all the suffering, to ensure that others wouldn't fall into the same traps we had. We scheduled a meeting to discuss further details, including other victims who might be interested in participating. The meeting took place in a community room 2 weeks later. 8 victims from our group attended, including Margaret Bloom, who insisted on attending despite her mobility difficulties. David presented his vision, an organization that would offer free workshops in community centers, libraries, and senior centers, teaching people how to identify warning signs of financial fraud. We would create educational materials, maintain a website with resources, and possibly even partner with government consumer protection agencies. Each of us could contribute according to our skills and availability. It would be unpaid, voluntary, a way to transform our personal tragedy into protection for others. The idea was met with unanimous enthusiasm. Margaret offered to share her story in workshops, saying that seeing an elderly woman could make people understand that no one is immune to these scams. The young couple, Rachel and Tom, who now had a 2-week-old baby, said they could help with social media and digital marketing when they had more time. Each person found a way to contribute. We decided to call the organization the Trust But Verify Foundation. This would be our central motto. It wasn't about never trusting anyone, but about doing proper due diligence, even with people we love. Trust and prudence didn't have to be mutually exclusive. Over the next few months, I dove headfirst into the Foundation's work as a way to channel my energy and process the trauma productively. David and I became the principal co-founders, working closely to establish the non-profit's legal structure. We hired a non-profit attorney who helped us navigate the bureaucratic process of registering, obtaining 501c3 tax-exempt status, and establishing a board of directors. Margaret Bloom, despite her age and frail health, insisted on serving on the board, saying she wanted to use her remaining time to ensure other older adults would not go through what she had. Her determination was inspiring. Our first workshop took place at a public library in Portland on a rainy Saturday afternoon in May. We weren't sure if anyone would come. We'd simply advertise through flyers in the library itself and at a few community centers. To our surprise and delight, 23 people showed up. They were mostly older people, but there were also a few young adults and even a middle-aged couple who had recently inherited money and were concerned about protecting it. David began with a presentation on the most common types of financial fraud, using statistics and examples. Then Margaret shared her story with Marcus, her voice trembling with emotion but never lacking in clarity and honesty. When it was my turn to speak, I felt the familiar weight of reliving the trauma. But something was different this time. I wasn't just retelling a painful story. I was using that pain as an educational tool. I explained in detail the manipulative tactics Marcus had used on me, the warning signs I'd ignored because he was family, the gradual progression from trust to exploitation. I saw people in the audience taking notes, nodding in recognition, some with tears in their eyes, likely remembering their own experiences or near-experiencings. By the end of the presentation, we'd spent nearly an hour answering questions. People were genuinely engaged, asking thoughtful, specific questions about how to protect themselves and their loved ones. A woman in her 70s approached me after the workshop. She was visibly moved and held my hand tightly. She said her son had recently borrowed $20,000 from her for an investment that sounded very similar to the scheme Marcus had used. She was about to transfer the money the following week, but after hearing our presentation, she would ask more questions and request proper documentation before proceeding. If the answers weren't satisfactory, she wouldn't lend the money. That moment was deeply gratifying. Perhaps we had just saved that woman from losing her savings. Perhaps the suffering I had endured had served to protect at least one person from going through the same hell. It was a small consolation, but it was something. The success of the first workshop led to invitations to present at other venues. A senior centre in Beaverton invited us. A church in Gresham asked us to give a presentation after Sunday service. A community college wanted us to speak to students about identity fraud and pyramid schemes targeting young people through social media. Within 3 months, we had given 12 presentations to a total of nearly 200 people. We created a simple website where we made educational materials available for free download. David, using his investigative skills, compiled a comprehensive list of warning signs, questions to ask before investing money with someone, and resources for reporting suspected fraud. While the Foundation's work gave me purpose, my personal life also slowly began to stabilize. I landed a job as a civil engineer at a mid-size firm in Portland, Carter Engineering, ironically with the same last name as me, but no relation. The salary was $78,000 a year, substantially less than I expected to earn with my own company. But it was stable, had full benefits including health insurance, and didn't carry the constant stress of owning a business. My boss, a man named Robert Carter, was fair and respectful. He knew my story because it had been covered in the local papers, but never mentioned it unless I brought it up. Jennifer also had good news. She received a promotion at the school where she taught, becoming coordinator of the English department with a salary increase of $6,000 a year. It was recognition of her hard work and also a small additional financial relief. For the first time in over a year, we were able to go out to dinner at a restaurant without obsessively calculating every dollar spent. We even managed to take a weekend on the Oregon coast, staying at a modest inn in Cannon Beach. Walking the beach with Jennifer, listening to the waves, smelling the salty air, it was the closest thing to peace I'd felt since it all began. It wasn't perfect, the wounds were still there, but it was beginning to heal. The relationship with my parents remained complicated. My mother had visited Marcus in prison 3 more times in the month since his sentencing. She never went into detail about the visits, only saying that Marcus was doing well, considering the circumstances, that he was working in the prison library, and that he had begun therapy with a psychologist there. Part of me was irritated that she maintained contact with him, but I understood that maternal love operates on dimensions that defy logic. My father, on the other hand, maintained his stance of no contact. He and my mother had developed an unspoken understanding not to discuss Marcus in front of each other to avoid conflict, but this created a zone of silence in their marriage, a forbidden topic that lingered unspoken but ever present. About 8 months after his sentencing, I received a letter from the federal prison where Marcus was being held. This time, it wasn't from Marcus, but from the prison psychologist, Dr. Alan Foster. The letter explained that Marcus had given permission for him to contact me as part of his therapeutic process. Dr. Foster wrote that Marcus was working on understanding the thought and behavior patterns that led to his crimes, that he was making genuine progress in therapy, and that part of his recovery work involved making amends, even if symbolic, to those he had hurt. Marcus wanted to know if I would be willing to participate in a restorative mediation session, a process facilitated by trained professionals where victims and offenders could communicate in a controlled environment. My initial reaction was anger. Marcus wanted me to facilitate his recovery journey. He wanted me to invest my time and emotional energy in helping him feel better about himself. The audacity seemed infinite. I showed the letter to Jennifer, expecting her to validate my anger and advise me to decline. But she surprised me. She said that before deciding, I should research restorative justice, understand what it really entailed. It wasn't about making things easier for Marcus. It was about giving victims a voice and agency in the justice process. If done correctly, it could be therapeutic for me too, an opportunity to confront Marcus directly, ask the questions that haunted me, get direct answers in a setting where he couldn't simply run away. I spent weeks researching restorative justice. I read academic studies, articles by victims who had participated in the process, interviews with facilitators. What I learned surprised me. Restorative justice wasn't about letting offenders off easy or replacing punishment with emotional conversations. It was a rigorous process that required offenders to take full responsibility for their actions, listen without defensiveness to the devastating impact they had caused, and work to make amends to the extent possible. For victims, it offered something the traditional judicial process often lacked: the opportunity to be heard directly by the offender, to ask questions, to fully express the impact of the crime. It wasn't a guarantee of forgiveness or reconciliation. It was about mutual understanding and closure. I talked to David about the letter. He had received an identical one and had already decided to participate. He said he saw it as an opportunity to look Marcus in the eye in a context where Marcus couldn't manipulate or run away, where he would have to answer direct questions honestly. Margaret Bloom had also received the letter and was considering participating, but her health was declining, and she was unsure she had the energy for the emotionally intense process. Each victim was making their own decisions based on their individual needs. There was no right or wrong answer, only what worked for each person in their healing journey. After much thought and lengthy discussions with Jennifer and my own therapist, whom I had begun seeing regularly a few months earlier, I decided to participate. But I set clear conditions. I wanted the session to be facilitated by experienced restorative justice professionals, not just Dr. Foster. I wanted Jennifer to be present as my support, and I wanted assurances that if at any point I felt Marcus was being manipulative or dishonest, I could end the session without any obligation to continue. I communicated these conditions through Dr. Foster, who responded that they were all reasonable and would be accommodated. The session was scheduled for 3 weeks later in a special room in the prison designated for this type of meeting. The days leading up to the session were tense. I prepared a list of questions I wanted to ask Marcus, things that kept me awake at night, that obsessively circled through my head. Why did he specifically target me? When exactly did he decide he was going to steal from me? Did he ever feel remorse while doing it? Was the love he showed me during my childhood and adolescence genuine, or was I always just a long-term investment? How could he look me in the eye during family dinners, knowing what he was planning? The questions were endless, but I tried to focus on the most important ones, the ones whose answers could genuinely help me understand and process what happened. Jennifer noticed I was more anxious than I had been in months. My sleep, which had improved considerably, was disturbed again. Nightmares about Marcus returned, dreams where he'd appear on my doorstep smiling as if nothing had happened, or where I'd discover I'd stolen even more than I'd thought. Jennifer held me at night, reminding me that these were just dreams, that Marcus was trapped, that I was safe. She questioned more than once if I was truly ready for that session, if it wouldn't be better to wait longer. But I knew that if I waited, I'd probably never feel ready. Anxiety never completely disappears before difficult things. You just learn to do the difficult thing despite the anxiety. The morning of the session arrived with a heavy grey sky, typical of autumn in Oregon. Jennifer and I drove to the federal prison, located about 40 minutes outside of Portland. The building was intimidating, surrounded by high fences topped with barbed wire, guard towers, all designed to remind us that this was a place of punishment and confinement. We passed through multiple security checkpoints, identification checks, and metal detectors. It was uncomfortable and dehumanizing, but also a visceral reminder that Marcus was paying a real price for his actions. He lived there, in that cold, institutional environment, every day. There was a dark satisfaction in that, even if there was also sadness. We were led into a small room with concrete walls, painted an institutional beige. There was a simple table in the center with plastic chairs around it. 2 facilitators were already there, middle-aged women with professional but warm expressions. They introduced themselves as Linda and Sarah, restorative justice experts who had worked with the federal prison system for years. They explained the process in detail, established ground rules, and made it clear that I was in control and could stop at any time. Then they asked if I was ready. I looked at Jennifer, who took my hand and nodded encouragingly. I took a deep breath and said yes, I was ready. Linda got up and went to get Marcus. My heart began to beat faster. In a few moments, I would be face to face with my brother for the first time since the sentencing hearing, for the first time in a context where we would have to actually talk. The door opened, and Marcus walked in, accompanied by Linda. He looked different than when I'd seen him at the sentencing hearing. He'd gained some weight back, his face no longer as hollow and pale. He wore the standard orange prison uniform, but he was clean-shaven. His eyes immediately met mine, and I saw something that seemed like a mixture of shame, fear, and hope. He sat in the chair Linda had indicated across the table, keeping his hands visible on the surface as instructed. Jennifer sat beside me, her physical presence grounding me as I tried to control the storm of emotions that arose from seeing my brother in person for the first time in over a year. Sarah, one of the facilitators, began by explaining the rules to both of them again. Marcus would speak first, taking full responsibility for his actions without justification or excuse. Then I would have the opportunity to speak, ask questions, and express the impact of his crimes. Marcus could not interrupt or defend himself, only listen. Later, there would be opportunity for freer dialogue, but the facilitators would intervene if the conversation became too heated or unproductive. Marcus nodded that he understood. His voice was low when Sarah asked him to begin. He cleared his throat nervously and began speaking, keeping his eyes fixed on the table at first, then forcing himself to look at me directly. Marcus began by saying there weren't enough words to express how ashamed and remorseful he was. He said he'd spent every day for the past 8 months thinking about what he'd done, about the people he'd hurt, especially me and our parents. He acknowledged that he'd betrayed the most fundamental trust possible, that of family, and that he understood that betrayal was probably unforgivable. His voice trembled as he said that the worst part wasn't being in prison or losing his freedom, but knowing he'd destroyed his relationship with his younger brother, the person he genuinely loved, and who had looked up to him as a hero throughout their childhood. I saw tears begin to form in his eyes, but I kept my expression neutral, not wanting to give him emotional validation just yet. He continued, going into specific details that the facilitators had clearly worked with him to prepare. He admitted that when he met Vanessa 3 years ago, he was at a vulnerable point in his life. He had just gotten out of a long-term relationship, was feeling professionally stagnant, and had accumulated credit card debt from a lifestyle he couldn't truly afford. Vanessa represented something exciting and dangerous, and when she suggested they could make easy money through investment schemes, he initially resisted. But she was persuasive, arguing that rich people wouldn't miss some money, that they were simply redistributing wealth in unconventional ways. Marcus said he knew those arguments were weak and false, but he chose to believe them because he wanted the money. The moment Marcus described as a turning point was when he pulled off his first small scam with a co-worker, stealing $5,000. He expected to feel crushing guilt, but instead he felt a surge of empowerment and excitement. It was too easy, and the person didn't even suspect him because they were friends. That was dangerous, Marcus admitted, because it confirmed the belief Vanessa had planted, that he was smart enough to do it, that people were gullible and easily manipulated, that he deserved the money more than they did. From there, it was a gradual progression of bigger targets, more elaborate schemes, more complex lies. By the time he reached the point of targeting me, he was so deep in the criminal mindset that I was just another mark, just another source of money. But Marcus stopped and corrected himself. He said that wasn't entirely true, that he was trying to sugarcoat it somehow. The truth, he admitted with visible difficulty, was that I was a particularly valuable target precisely because I was his brother. I would trust him completely. I wouldn't do the due diligence. I would believe any story he told. He knew exactly how to manipulate me because he'd known me my entire life, my insecurities, my dreams, my trusting nature. He had deliberately used all this intimate knowledge as a weapon against me. It was planned, calculated, cruel. There was no sugarcoating or justifying it. When he finished that part, he covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Sarah gave Marcus a moment to compose himself before indicating it was my turn to speak. I looked at my list of questions, but they suddenly seemed inadequate. There was so much I wanted to say, so much that needed to be expressed. I began by talking about the morning I learned the truth, driving to Seattle with a knot in my stomach, finding the office non-existent, the house empty. I described the feeling of derealization, as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. I explained that it wasn't just about the money, although that was devastating enough. It was about realizing that the person I trusted most in the world had seen me as prey, that every interaction we'd had during those months had been based on lies and calculated manipulation. I told Marcus about the practical consequences of his actions. The company I'd sacrificed so much to build, destroyed before it even had a real chance of success. The employees I'd fired, men with families who depended on those jobs. The nights driving Ubers until 3 a.m., physically and emotionally exhausted, trying to pay the bills. The humiliation of having to borrow money from Jennifer's parents. The constant fear of losing our home. The dreams of having children postponed indefinitely because we lacked financial stability. Each item on the list was a stone I added to the pile of consequences, wanting him to feel the full weight of what he'd done. I saw Marcus shrink visually with each revelation, but I didn't stop. He needed to hear it all. Then I talked about the impact on our parents. I described how my mother developed severe anxiety, how she had to start medication for the first time in her life, how my father, always so strong and optimistic, had become a shell of himself, depressed and isolated, how their marriage, solid for 42 years, was under immense strain as they processed his betrayal in completely different ways. I explained that he hadn't just stolen from our parents financially, taking $25,000 from their carefully managed savings. He had stolen their peace in their golden years, had tarnished decades-old memories, had created a wound in their family that might never fully heal. I saw Marcus crying openly now, but I felt no pity. Those tears were the absolute bare minimum he owed. I then asked the questions I had prepared. I asked when exactly he decided to target me. Marcus replied in a broken voice that it was about 6 months before he came with the investment proposal. He and Vanessa were planning a bigger scam, and I had casually mentioned at a family lunch that I was saving money to start my own company. Vanessa immediately recognized it as the perfect opportunity, and Marcus agreed. He spent the next few months building even more trust, being the perfect brother, laying the groundwork. Hearing it confirmed out loud was like being stabbed again. 6 months of premeditation, of acting, of calculated deceit. I asked if he felt any remorse while he was doing this, in the moments we were together having dinner, watching games, talking about life. Marcus hesitated, clearly struggling with honesty. He finally admitted that there were moments of guilt, especially when he saw my excitement about the company, my gratitude for his help. But he suppressed those feelings, rationalizing that I would eventually get more money, that I was young and would recover. Vanessa also constantly encouraged him not to feel guilt, saying that feelings were weak and hindered success. So he compartmentalized, separating the brother who stole from the brother who spent time with me. It was pathetic to hear that explanation, but at least he was honest about how he managed to do something so monstrous. My last big question was whether the love he showed us during our childhood and adolescence was real. It was something that constantly plagued me, the doubt that my entire childhood had been a lie. Marcus looked me straight in the eye when he answered that. He said with conviction that it was absolutely real, that the brother who taught me to ride a bike, who defended me from bullies, who stayed up talking about dreams, that person was genuine. The problem, he said, was that he had changed. Or maybe he had always had that capacity for cruelty within him, and it only manifested itself when the right circumstances aligned. But the brotherly love he felt during my childhood wasn't a performance. It was real. I wanted to believe it, needed to believe that it hadn't all been lies. But I honestly didn't know if I could trust anything that came out of his mouth. Linda, one of the facilitators, intervened at this point, asking if I had anything else I needed to express. I took a deep breath and decided to be completely honest about where I was emotionally. I told Marcus that I didn't know if I could ever forgive him, that forgiveness wasn't something he could expect or demand. It was something only I could give if and when I was ready, and perhaps I never would be. I explained that coming here wasn't about reconciliation or restoring our relationship. I came because I needed answers. I needed to look him in the eye and tell him directly how much his actions had destroyed me. I also came because I was working on my own healing, and that was part of the process. But it was about me, not him. Marcus nodded, tears still streaming down his face. He said he understood completely, that he didn't expect forgiveness, and didn't think he deserved it. All he asked was that I believe his remorse was genuine, that he would use the next 15 years to try to become a better person, to understand how he had lost himself so completely. When he got out of prison, if I never wanted to see him again, he would completely respect that. But if someday, years in the future, I decided to give him a chance to prove he'd changed, he would spend the rest of his life trying to make amends, I didn't respond to that. There was nothing to say. The future was completely uncertain, and I wasn't going to make promises or give false hope. Sarah asked if Jennifer had anything she wanted to say. I was surprised. I hadn't thought of it, but Jennifer nodded and spoke for the first time. She looked directly at Marcus and said that he had not only destroyed her husband's life, but also hers by extension. She had stayed up countless nights holding me while I had panic attacks, had worked overtime to keep food on the table, had postponed dreams of motherhood because Marcus had robbed her of the financial and emotional stability necessary to bring a child into the world. She said that, as a wife, she saw the daily impact of his actions in ways he probably never considered, and that while she respected the restorative justice process, he shouldn't mistake her participation there as approval or forgiveness. It was simply support for the man she loved. Marcus listened silently, clearly not expecting Jennifer to confront him either, but nodded in acceptance. The session lasted almost 3 hours in total. By the end, we were all emotionally exhausted. The facilitators debriefed, checking in with Jennifer and me to see if we needed anything. I thanked them for conducting the session professionally and sensitively. Before we left, Marcus asked one last thing. He asked if I would consider, not now, but perhaps in the future, letting our parents know that he was genuinely working on changing. That he wasn't just doing time, but actively trying to become better. He said he didn't want them to spend the remaining years of their lives imagining their son was a monster lost forever. I didn't promise anything, just said I'd think about it. With that, I stood up, Jennifer at my side, and we left the room without looking back. The drive back from prison was silent for the first 20 minutes. Jennifer drove because I was too emotionally drained to focus on the road. I stared out the window at the Oregon landscape passing by, evergreen trees beneath a grey sky, a light rain beginning to fall again. Finally, Jennifer broke the silence by asking how I was feeling. I tried to articulate the jumble of emotions. There was relief at having confronted Marcus directly, at having said everything I needed to say, at having asked the questions that haunted me, but there was also a deep, renewed sadness, because hearing Marcus admit everything in such detail made it all more viscerally real. I could no longer hide behind assumptions or uncertainty. He knew exactly how and why he had been betrayed. Jennifer asked if I thought Marcus's repentance was genuine. That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? I answered honestly that I didn't know for sure. He certainly seemed genuinely remorseful. His tears seemed real. His admissions were more detailed and self-incriminating than they needed to be. But Marcus had always been a good actor, always known how to say and do the right things to get what he wanted. Maybe this was just another performance, this time aimed at some kind of forgiveness or eventual reconciliation. Or maybe he really was changing, facing who he had become, trying to build something better from the wreckage of his life. I genuinely didn't know, and perhaps I never would know for sure. All I could do was focus on my own healing, not his redemption. In the weeks following that session, I realized something interesting. While I still felt anger and sadness when I thought about Marcus, there was also a small sense of closure that hadn't been there before. Confronting him directly, hearing the answers I needed, even if painful, had been cathartic in a way I hadn't expected. It didn't mean I was ready to forgive or forget, but it did mean I was no longer trapped in an endless cycle of unanswered questions. I could begin to truly move forward, not because everything was perfectly resolved, but because I had achieved a kind of resolution that was possible within the impossible circumstances. Our work with the Trust But Verify Foundation continued to grow. Within a year of our first presentation, we had delivered workshops to over 600 people across Oregon. We expanded into Washington, D.C. too, presenting in Seattle, Tacoma, and Spokane. We received a small grant of $5,000 from AARP, the American Organization for Retirees, which recognized the value of our work protecting seniors. We used the money to create professional brochures, improve our website, and pay for rooms for larger workshops. Margaret Bloom, despite her steadily declining health, participated in 12 presentations that year, her story deeply touching each audience. She became the kind but resilient face of the foundation. David Hernandez had become more than a colleague at the foundation. He had become a true friend. He and Elena often invited us to dinner, and Jennifer and I reciprocated. These were moments where we could be normal, where we weren't defined solely by having been victims of fraud. We talked about politics, movies, sports, and plans for the future. David was considering writing a book about our experience and the foundation's work, something that could reach even more people. I encouraged the idea, offering to contribute a chapter if he followed through. There was something powerful about transforming personal trauma into public education, about ensuring that our suffering wasn't completely in vain. My professional career was also stabilizing in unexpected ways. Robert Carter, my boss, was impressed with my work and offered me a promotion to senior project manager with a $15,000 annual raise. It wasn't the same as owning my own company, but I was building a solid reputation, working on interesting projects, and having the financial security that an established company offered. I learned that success didn't just have to be entrepreneurial or being my own boss. I could find meaning and satisfaction in doing good work within a corporate structure, contributing to larger projects that I could never accomplish alone. Jennifer and I finally had the conversation about children again. It was 2 years after the whole crisis with Marcus began. Financially, we were in a much better position. We had saved almost $20,000. We were debt-free beyond the mortgage, and we both had stable jobs. Emotionally, I still had some reservations, but I recognized that I would never feel completely ready, that there would always be some level of anxiety about bringing a child into a world where betrayal and pain existed. But I also recognized that I couldn't let Marcus's actions control every important decision in my life. If I did, he would continue to have power over me even from inside prison. Jennifer deserved to be a mother if that was what she wanted, and I wanted to give her that. We started trying to get pregnant that spring. It took a few months, but in September, Jennifer tested positive. The joy and terror I felt simultaneously were indescribable. We were going to have a baby. We were going to bring a new life into the world, a life that would carry part of me and part of Jennifer, but that would be its own person with its own path. That child would never know Uncle Marcus, at least not while it was young. Perhaps as an adult, if Marcus truly changed during his years in prison, we might reconsider. But for now, my son or daughter would grow up in a nuclear family of 3, shielded from the knowledge of the betrayal that had nearly destroyed their parents before they even existed. My parents welcomed the news of the pregnancy with tears of joy. It was something good, something pure and hopeful amidst so much trauma of the past few years. My mother immediately began knitting blankets and baby clothes, a project that gave her purpose and distraction. My father began building a crib in his workshop, carefully working the wood with a smile on his face I hadn't seen in a long time. The unborn baby was already bringing healing to our family in small but significant ways. It didn't erase the past, it didn't make Marcus disappear or undo the damage, but it created something new to focus on. A renewed reason to look forward instead of getting stuck looking back. I eventually told my parents about the restorative justice session with Marcus, something I had initially kept private. My mother immediately wanted to know every detail, how he was, what he said, whether he seemed genuinely remorseful. I shared selectively, giving her information that might bring some comfort without giving false hope of reconciliation. I told her that Marcus was working on himself, in therapy, trying to understand how he lost his way. She held on to this information like precious treasures, clearly relieved to know her son wasn't completely lost. My father listened silently, and when I finished, he simply nodded. He didn't ask questions, didn't ask for elaboration. The simple fact that Marcus was alive and serving his sentence was enough information for him for now. In February, 3 years after Marcus's arrest, Margaret Bloom passed away. She was 75 years old, and her health had steadily declined over the months. I attended her funeral along with David and several other Foundation members. It was a simple but beautiful ceremony in a small church in Portland. Her grandchildren spoke of how strong she had been until the end, how she had turned a horrific experience into something positive through her work with the Foundation. They specifically mentioned that in her final months, when she was too weak to participate in workshops, she still received letters from people who had attended her presentations, thanking her for helping them avoid similar scams. Margaret died knowing she had made a difference, that her suffering had not been completely in vain. It was a powerful legacy. We decided to dedicate the next workshop to Margaret's memory. David prepared a tribute that touched on her resilience, her generosity of spirit, and her ability to forgive without forgetting. We also established a small scholarship fund in her name, intended to help victims of financial fraud who needed legal assistance but couldn't afford it. It was modest, just $2,000 initially, but would grow over time through donations. Margaret would have approved. It was always about helping others, about ensuring the cycle of victimization stopped. Her seat on the Foundation's board was filled by Rachel Patterson, the young mother who had lost her home ownership savings. The cycle continued, victims becoming advocates. My daughter was born in May, a rare sunny day in Portland, as if the universe was celebrating with us. We named her Emma Grace Carter. Holding that small, perfect life in my arms was transformative in ways I couldn't have imagined. All the pain, all the trauma, all the betrayal of the past few years didn't disappear, but they were put into perspective. Emma represented the future, hope, renewal. She would never know the price paid before her birth, the tears shed, the sleepless nights, the financial stress. For her, she would grow up in a loving, stable family, surrounded by adoring parents and pampered grandparents. That was a victory, a way Marcus hadn't completely destroyed our future, even though he'd severely damaged our past. My mother asked a few weeks after Emma's birth if I would consider sending Marcus photos of the baby. She said he had asked about me in his letters to her, that he would be thrilled to know he had become an uncle. My answer was firm but gentle. No. Marcus had forfeited the right to be a part of the important milestones in my life when he decided to steal and betray me. He would not know my daughter, not through photos, letters, or any other means, at least not while he was in prison, and perhaps never. This wasn't wanton cruelty. It was necessary protection. Emma deserved to start her life free from the burden of her family's dark history. My mother was sad but understood. She respected my decision without argument. The following years unfolded with a normalcy I'd forgotten was possible. Emma grew from a baby to a toddler, each milestone a miracle that Jennifer and I celebrated. Her first steps, her first words, her first day of preschool. The Foundation continued to thrive, now holding workshops in 3 states and having helped protect literally thousands of people from potential fraud. David finally wrote his book, Trust But Verify, Surviving Financial Fraud and Finding Purpose in Pain, which was published by a small but reputable publisher. I gave several speaking engagements promoting the book, my story now a more permanent part of the public record. It was strange, but also empowering. Professionally, I continued to advance at Carter Engineering. I was promoted to Director of Operations after 6 years with the company, earning $120,000 annually, more than I had ever imagined when I took that first job, just for stability. We were able to move to a larger house, in a better neighborhood in Portland, with a backyard where Emma could play. Jennifer eventually stopped teaching to stay home with Emma, something she had always wanted to do. Financially, we were comfortable for the first time in our adult lives. We weren't rich, but we had security, savings, and the ability to give our daughter opportunities we hadn't had. It was a good life, built on the ashes of the one Marcus had destroyed. Marcus had served 9 years of his sentence when something unexpected happened. He was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, a type of cancer of the lymphatic system. Treatment was available through the prison medical system, but the prognosis was uncertain. My mother called me in a panic when she found out, begging me to consider visiting him, saying he might die in prison without ever having the chance to see his family again. Her emotional plea was powerful and genuine. She wasn't asking me to forgive Marcus or restore our relationship, just that I consider giving him a chance to see his brother one last time if the worst happened. It was an impossible position. There was no right or wrong answer. I spoke at length with Jennifer about my mother's request. She, ever wise, said she couldn't make that decision for me, but that she would support me whatever I chose. She asked what I thought I would regret more in the future. Visiting Marcus and potentially reopening poorly healed wounds, or not visiting him and living with the possibility that he would die wanting to make amends, and I having denied him that opportunity. I also thought about Emma, who was now 4 years old. One day she would ask questions about family, about why she didn't have an Uncle Marcus in her life. How would I answer those questions? I wanted to be able to honestly say that I did everything I could to handle the situation with integrity, even when it was painful. After weeks of deep internal deliberation, I decided to visit Marcus. Not for him, but for myself, for my mother. For peace of mind that I had done what I could within the limits of what was emotionally possible. I went alone this time. Jennifer offered to go, but said it was something I needed to do alone. The trip to the prison was familiar. I had made that journey once before for the restorative justice session. But this time I felt different. He didn't go with burning anger or a need for confrontation. He went with a kind of weary acceptance, acknowledging that Marcus was my brother, for better or worse, and that if he was dying, there was a basic humanity in not letting him die completely alone, apart from our mother. Marcus was visibly thinner. His hair had completely fallen out from the chemotherapy. He looked fragile in a way that shocked me. We sat separated by thick glass, speaking through phones like in scenes from prison movies. He burst into tears as soon as he saw me, repeatedly saying thank you for coming, that he hadn't expected me to, that it meant more than I could imagine. I didn't respond emotionally, maintaining my composure. I told him I came because our mother asked, because he was human, and no human should face potential death completely isolated from family. But I made it clear that this didn't mean forgiveness or reconciliation. It was just two people connected by blood and history sitting together for an hour. We spoke in a strangely normal way considering the circumstances. Marcus asked about my life, if I was okay, if I had managed to rebuild. I spoke selectively about my work, about the foundation, about having a stable life. I didn't mention Emma. That was still off limits. He talked about his life in prison, the educational programs he had completed, the books he had read, the ongoing therapy. He said that cancer had put everything into even sharper perspective, that he truly realized he had wasted precious years of freedom on greed and stupidity. If he survived and was eventually released, he wanted to live a completely different life, simple and honest, focused on making amends where possible. I didn't comment on those plans, just listened. As visiting hours drew to a close, Marcus said something final. He said, "Danny, I know you'll probably never forgive me, and you're right. I don't deserve forgiveness. But I want you to know that your success in rebuilding your life, despite what I did, the work you're doing to protect others through the foundation, gives me some measure of peace. You've turned the worst of me into something good through who you are. That doesn't absolve me of anything, but it means something to know you're okay. I didn't know what to say to that. I simply nodded, said goodbye, and left. I cried in the car in the prison parking lot for 20 minutes, all the complex emotions I'd been holding in finally spilling out. They weren't tears of forgiveness or reconciliation. They were tears of mourning for the relationship that would never be again. Marcus survived cancer. The treatment worked better than the doctors expected, and after 8 months, he went into remission. It was both a relief and a complication. Part of me had prepared myself psychologically for him to die in prison, closing that chapter for good. Now he would live to complete his sentence and eventually be released. What that would mean for me, my family, and our parents was uncertain. But I decided I wouldn't waste emotional energy worrying about a future still 6 years away. I would focus on the present, on the good life I had built, the family I was raising, the meaningful work I was doing. And so life went on. Emma started kindergarten, a bright and curious girl who had Jennifer's smile and my eyes. The foundation celebrated its 5th anniversary, having positively impacted over 3,000 people through workshops and educational materials. My parents aged more gracefully, Marcus's wound still present, but no longer completely dominating their lives. They had Emma to focus on, grandchildren's events to attend, reasons to smile again. Jennifer and I celebrated 10 years of marriage, stronger for having survived together, something that destroys many marriages. We haven't forgotten what Marcus did, we never will, but we've learned to live fully despite it, not because of it. Today, sitting in my office on a quiet Friday, gazing out the window at the Portland skyline in the rare sunshine, I reflect on the journey of the past few years. I think about the man I was when it all began, full of naive dreams and boundless confidence. I think about who I've become, more cautious certainly, perhaps more cynical, definitely wiser. I lost a brother, not to death, but to something equally final. A betrayal so profound that the relationship was irreparable. But I gained other things too, a deeper understanding of human resilience, a community of survivors who became friends, a purpose in protecting others from what I went through. I don't know what will happen when Marcus is released in a few years. Maybe he's truly changed, become the better person he claims to be working to be. Maybe he's just another version of the same lies he always told so well. Honestly, I don't know if it matters much anymore. He doesn't have the power over my life he once did. I've built something new and strong from the ashes of what he destroyed. I have a family I love and who loves me back. I have meaningful work both professionally and through the foundation. I have peace, not perfect but real, earned through years of hard emotional and therapeutic work. If I could go back and change things, avoid all that pain, would I? Obviously, the immediate emotional response is yes. But when I think more deeply, I'm not sure. That horrific experience shaped me in profound ways, taught me lessons I would never have learned otherwise, led me to work that genuinely makes a difference in people's lives. I'm not grateful for the betrayal, never will be, but I am grateful for who I've become in response to it. I'm stronger, more compassionate, more aware of the complexity of human morality and the value of genuine relationships. For anyone reading or listening to this story, I hope you learn a few lessons. First, trust is precious but shouldn't be blind, even with family. Verifying information, asking difficult questions, and requesting proper documentation isn't a lack of trust. It's basic prudence. Second, if you're a victim of fraud or betrayal, know that it's possible to survive and eventually thrive again. The path is long and painful, but it is possible. Don't be alone. Seek help and find community. Third, transform your pain into purpose where possible. Not all suffering can have meaning, but we can create meaning through what we do in response to it. As for Marcus, I don't know if he's truly changed or if he ever will. It's not my responsibility to discover or facilitate his redemption. Each person must do their own work of healing and transformation. What I can say is that I've cut ties with the person he was, the criminal who betrayed me. If one day he truly becomes someone different, there may be room to reconsider some kind of distant relationship. But it will be on my terms, in my time, if and when I decide. Not out of family obligation or pressure from others, but because I genuinely believe it's healthy and safe for me and my family. Until then, I live my life fully, love my family completely, and work daily to ensure that Marcus's story doesn't define my story. This is my story. It's a story of betrayal, loss, and profound pain. But it's also a story of survival, rebuilding, and finding strength where you didn't know it existed. It's not a story with a perfectly happy ending, because real life rarely works that way. But it's a story of real hope, the kind that only comes from having faced the worst and still choosing to move forward. If you're going through your own betrayal or pain, know that you can survive. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but you can rebuild. You can find joy again. You can create a life worth living, even when it seems impossible. I'm living proof of that. Thank you for listening to my story. If it helped even one person avoid similar fraud or inspired a survivor to not give up, then every painful detail was worth sharing. And if you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the channel and leave your thoughts on this story in the comments. Your stories and support matter too.